The trade happened in the middle of the day, on September 14th, 1858, right outside the Anderson County Courthouse in Palestine, Texas. James Henry Garrett, a well-known cotton farmer, handed over control of his wife, a woman whose weight had reached 347 pounds, to a horse trader named Silas Beaumont. In return, Garrett got one purebred Morgan stallion worth $600. People watching stood in shocked silence as both men signed papers making the trade official, while Delilah May Garrett stood next to them, her face showing no emotion. The crowd expected a scandal. What they got instead was far worse. Because Silas Beaumont hadn't made this trade out of kindness or a business chance, he had planned the whole situation as cold revenge against the man who had insulted him. And what Beaumont did next over the following months would destroy everything James Garrett loved more than the wife he had traded away. This is the story of the most shocking trade in Texas history and the revenge that came after it. Before we go on with the story of how a horse trader turned one man's cruelty into the perfect payback, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state or city you are listening from. Stories like this one deserve to be remembered, and your comments help us find more forgotten parts of American history. Palestine, Texas, in 1858, was one of the richest towns in Anderson County. It was located along the important trade route between Houston and the Red River settlements. With a population close to 2,000 people, the town had 3 cotton gins, 2 banks, a courthouse built from stone brought from far away, and enough brick buildings along Main Street to rival cities twice its size. Money from cotton and wood had turned Palestine from a rough border town into a polite southern town in less than 20 years, complete with a book club, a Masonic lodge, and families whose names were on land papers going back to the Texas Republic. The Garrett family held an important spot in this social ladder. James Henry Garrett had received 400 acres of good land from his father, along with 12 enslaved workers and a simple but nice two-story house built in a style that showed he wanted to be a top-level planter. At 34 years old, James had grown his land to 600 acres and increased his workers to 18, putting himself in a position to enter the county's highest social group. He dressed well, went to the Methodist church every week, and served as the money keeper for the local farm group. His wife, Delilah May, had been born Delilah Thornton, the daughter of a store owner family in nearby Crockett. Their marriage 7 years earlier had been seen as good for both families. The Thorntons gained a connection to land wealth while James got a large amount of money and goods, plus the social standing that came with an educated wife who could read French and play the piano. Wedding guests at the Thornton home in June 1851 had commented on what a good-looking couple they made, though even then Delilah May carried more weight than fashion thought looked good for a woman of 22. Over the following years, Delilah May's size had grown a lot. Some said it was because of the twins born dead in their second year of marriage, a loss that sent her into deep sadness and lazy habits. Others whispered about the cook who made big meals that Delilah May ate alone in the afternoon after James had gone back to the fields. By 1858, Delilah May rarely left the Garrett house, spending her days in the sitting room with her sewing or upstairs in her bedroom, where servants brought meals on trays. Her size had become a topic of gossip all over Palestine, not just for how she looked, but for what it meant about James Garrett's control of his home, and by extension, his fitness for the high social circles he wanted to join. James' anger with his home situation had become very clear to those who knew him. At farm group meetings, after several glasses of whiskey, he would complain about the heavy load of keeping a household that gave him no sons, no social gain, and increasingly no escape from shame. The money from the Thornton family had long since been used up in farm costs. Delilah May's social friends had faded away along with her ability to be part of county society. What was left was a woman who, in James' view, cost more in food and shame than she added to his goals. Silas Beaumont was a very different kind of person in Anderson County society. A horse trader who worked from a large property 5 miles west of Palestine, Beaumont had come to Texas from Kentucky in 1852, with a name for finding good horse bloodlines and an amazing ability to train difficult animals. He stood well over 6 feet tall with the thin, tough build of a man who spent his days in saddles and pens rather than living rooms. His voice had a Kentucky accent that became stronger when talking about horses, which was most of the time. Unlike the settled planters who made up Palestine's top group, Beaumont lived a life of constant movement, traveling all over East Texas and into Louisiana, Arkansas, and the Indian Territory, buying and selling horses, sometimes gone for weeks at a time. His property showed this traveling lifestyle: a large barn kept with great care, several well-built pens, and a simple house that clearly served as a stopping point rather than a home. Beaumont hired 3 men to keep his business running while he was away. 2 handlers for the horses and 1 older black man named Abraham who cooked and kept the house. Beaumont's business brought him into contact with every level of Anderson County society. Planters needed good animals for field work and travel. Common farmers needed strong work animals. Even the town's Presbyterian minister had bought a gentle female horse from Beaumont for his wife. This open approach to business gave Beaumont unusual social freedom. He was invited to eat at planter tables when he had horses to show, but he also drank whiskey in places where gentlemen were afraid to be seen. He went to horse races, cockfights, and casual gatherings where business was done with handshakes rather than contracts. In June 1858, 3 months before the courthouse trade, Beaumont had sold James Garrett a young male horse that turned out to have a split hoof hidden under expert grooming. When James found the problem and demanded his money back, Beaumont had been in Arkansas. By the time he came back in mid-July, James had already spread word all over the county about the horse trader's dishonesty, hurting Beaumont's name among the planters who were his best customers. The event angered Beaumont not just for the lost business, but for what he saw as James lie about a trade that Beaumont thought was fair. The horse had been sold as is, and any expert horseman should have looked at the animal more carefully. Their argument at the farm group summer meeting had been short but unforgettable. James, surrounded by fellow planters, had loudly demanded payment. Beaumont, standing alone, had replied that any man who couldn't properly look at a horse before buying had no business questioning the seller's honor. The talk had ended with James ordering Beaumont off the property, and Beaumont answering with a smile that those there would later describe as very strange. "I'll have satisfaction for this insult," James had stated. "Name your terms. I'll think about the matter," Beaumont had replied, still wearing that strange smile, "and let you know when I've decided what is fair payment." The answer had seemed odd at the time. Beaumont's Kentucky accent making it sound almost polite, though several men present noted the cold planning in his eyes. In the culture of Southern honor that ruled such fights, James had basically challenged Beaumont to name the terms of their agreement. What none of them guessed was how literally Beaumont would take that invite. Throughout August, Beaumont asked questions around Palestine. He spoke with the Garrett family's house servants at the market, asking casual questions about how the house ran. He visited the Thornton family in Crockett, pretending to look at a female horse they had for sale, talking to Delilah May's father about his daughter's well-being. He went to church services at the Methodist church where the Garretts went, watching from the back row. To those who noticed, Beaumont appeared to be doing research, though for what reason remained unclear. Palestine in that summer of 1858 existed in a state of rich tension. Cotton prices stayed high, encouraging growth and betting. Political arguments about Kansas and the territories took up attention in the town's 3 newspapers. Young men formed soldier groups with fancy uniforms, practicing on Saturday afternoons, waiting for conflicts that still seemed far away and not real. Under this lively surface, the strict levels of Southern society ruled every interaction, and any break in the established order drew intense attention. Into this world, Silas Beaumont brought a plan that would break every rule about how such societies worked. The first sign that something unusual was happening came on September 10th, when Beaumont showed up at the Garrett plantation house in the middle of the morning, riding a beautiful Morgan stallion that drew immediate eyes from everyone who saw it. The horse stood tall with a deep chest, powerful back legs, and a coat so dark it looked almost black, except where sunlight showed hints of deep red, brown. Its bloodlines were clear in every part. This was a breeding animal worth a lot of money, the kind of animal that could build a planter's name for quality. James Garrett came out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a cloth, having been working in his office on farm accounts. His face changed from surprise at the visitor to clear interest in the stallion. Beaumont sat easily in the saddle, making no move to get down. "That is a remarkable animal," James said, walking down the porch steps for a closer look. "Morgan stock, fathered by Woodbury," Beaumont replied, naming one of the most famous Morgan lines. "Mother was pure Justin Morgan descent through Sherman. He is 4 years old, fully trained to saddle and harness, has a temper like silk, and he has already proven himself with 3 female horses back in Kentucky. Their babies sold for top dollar." James walked around the horse slowly, running his hands over the stallion's legs, checking teeth, checking shape with the eye of someone who understood quality. The horse stood perfectly still, showing the calm nature that made Morgan's valuable for more than just looks. "What is his price?" James asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the number would be more than he could pay. "I am not here to sell him to you," Beaumont said plainly. "I am here to offer a trade." James stepped back, confusion crossing his face. "I have nothing that would equal this animal's value. That is a matter of view," Beaumont replied. "I have given a lot of thought to our fight from July and to your challenge that I name terms for satisfaction. I have decided what would be fair payment for the damage you did to my name." "Name it then," James said, anger creeping into his voice. "I won't stand here playing guessing games." Beaumont looked toward the house, where a curtain moved in an upstairs window. Delilah May was watching from her usual spot. "I will trade you this stallion clear title in exchange for your wife." The words hung in the morning air like something solid, James' face went through several looks: confusion, disbelief, anger, then something more calculating. "That is crazy. You can't trade a horse for a person, for a wife, can't I?" Beaumont's tone remained casual. "You and I both know that property transfers happen every day in Anderson County. Women aren't property under law." "True enough, but marriages can be ended. Custody can be moved. Your wife's father provided a dowry when you married, basically a money transaction. I am simply suggesting a different kind of trade." "This is madness," James said, though his voice lacked the anger the situation seemed to call for. "No court would accept such a deal. Judge Patterson might see it differently," Beaumont said, naming the main judge who handled Anderson County legal matters. "Especially if both parties agree to the deal. Your wife has been basically locked in your house for 3 years now. You have made no secret of your unhappiness with the marriage. I am offering you a chance to solve the situation with a valuable asset to show for it." James stared at the horse trader, his mind clearly working through meanings and chances. "Why would you want such a deal? This makes no sense." "My reasons are my own," Beaumont replied. "But I promise you they are totally practical. I keep a household that needs management. Your wife was educated by the Thornton family. She can read, write, keep accounts, manage servants. Those are useful skills. Her current physical condition doesn't worry me. I am offering you freedom from a situation you have complained about publicly for 2 years, plus an asset worth $600. That is more generous than you deserve, considering the damage you did to my business." The talk continued for another 20 minutes, with James raising problems that Beaumont calmly answered. The legal part could be handled through creative paperwork. Delilah May's agreement would be gotten. Beaumont seemed sure on this point, though he didn't explain why. The social scandal could be survived, especially if James came out of the situation with a valuable stallion that would help rather than hurt his status. Throughout the discussion, Beaumont sat still on the Morgan while James walked the yard in front of his house. Finally, James asked the question that showed where his thinking had led. How would such a deal be written down? Beaumont pulled a folded paper from his coat. "I have already written terms. Judge Patterson has looked at the language and confirmed it falls within his power to sign, provided both parties and your wife all sign freely. The trade would be recorded at the courthouse as a mutual agreement ending your marriage and moving custody. That is the legal term we will use. To me, in exchange for valuable payment. The stallion's title transfers to you at the same time. And Delilah May would agree to this?" James asked, finally speaking his wife's name. "Why don't we ask her?" Beaumont said, getting down from the horse for the first time. What happened inside the Garrett house over the next hour remained private, though the 2 house servants who were there would later give broken accounts that raised more questions than they answered. Beaumont spoke with Delilah May alone in the sitting room for nearly 40 minutes while James waited in his office. When Beaumont finally came out, he reported that Mrs. Garrett had agreed to the deal and would sign the needed papers. James insisted on speaking with his wife himself, and their talk lasted only 10 minutes. When he came out, his face was pale, but set with purpose. "We will proceed," he said, "but I want this done properly at the courthouse with witnesses." "Agreed," Beaumont said. 4 days from now, September 14th, 10:00 in the morning, bring your wife. I will bring the horse and the papers. The 4 days between that talk and the courthouse meeting became a time of wild guessing throughout Palestine. Rumors began floating around by that evening. Broken stories from the Garrett house servants, notes from neighbors who had seen Beaumont's long visit, whispered ideas about what kind of business deal would need such secrecy. By September 12th, enough people knew that something unusual was planned that a small crowd began to gather outside the Anderson County Courthouse that morning, drawn by gossip and dark curiosity. September 14th, 1858, started clear and hot with a kind of heavy dampness that made clothes stick to skin and tempers turn short. By 9:30, more than 40 people had gathered in and around the courthouse, pretending to do normal business, but actually waiting to see what would happen. Judge Patterson had cleared his morning schedule, and the courthouse clerks prepared papers with unusual care, aware that whatever was recorded today would be looked at for years to come. James Garrett arrived at 9:45 in his best carriage, driven by one of his enslaved workers. Delilah May sat beside him, wearing a dark blue traveling dress that tried to fit her size while keeping some look of style. Her face showed no emotion that watchers could read, neither sadness nor happiness, just a kind of blank calm that made those watching unsure about her state of mind. Silas Beaumont arrived exactly at 10:00, leading the Morgan stallion and carrying a leather document case. He wore a formal coat over his usual rough clothes, the difference showing his outsider status. Judge Patterson met all 3 parties in his offices along with 2 courthouse clerks who would serve as witnesses. The papers that were signed that morning were later described by those who saw them as the most unusual legal papers ever processed through Anderson County. The main contract, written in Beaumont's clear hand on heavy paper, contained exact language. James Henry Garrett agreed to end his marriage to Delilah May Garrett and transfer full custody and responsibility for her welfare to Silas Beaumont. In exchange, Beaumont would transfer title to the Morgan stallion to James Garrett, along with breeding rights and full papers of bloodlines. Both parties admitted receiving valuable payment in the trade. A separate paper, signed by Delilah May alone, stated her agreement to the arrangement and her willing acceptance of Beaumont's custody and protection. The language carefully avoided specific words that might make the arrangement legally fightable while still creating a binding agreement that all parties understood. Judge Patterson signed both papers after asking each signer individually about their free choice. His face throughout the meeting remained professionally plain, though several witnesses later reported that his hand paused before applying his seal to the papers. The whole event lasted less than 30 minutes. When the parties came out from the courthouse, James Garrett held the Morgan's lead rope, while Silas Beaumont stood beside Delilah May. The crowd that had gathered watched in shocked silence as the trade was finished on the courthouse steps in full daylight, as public and official as any property trade in Anderson County history. James got on the Morgan and rode away without looking back at his former wife. Beaumont helped Delilah May into a wagon he had brought for the purpose, then drove west toward his property. The crowd broke up slowly, people speaking in quiet voices about what they had seen. Unsure whether they had seen a scandal, a tragedy, or something so far outside normal social rules that no familiar group could fit it. The Palestine newspaper printed nothing about the trade. The county's social leaders closed ranks around the Garrett name, treating the matter as something too dirty to admit. But in kitchens and workshops, in the market square and at the Cotton Gin, people talked about nothing else for weeks. Some called it the most shameful moment in Anderson County history. Others saw it as a kind of rough frontier justice, Beaumont taking satisfaction for the insult James had delivered. Almost no one in those first weeks considered what Delilah May Garrett thought about the arrangement, and almost no one guessed what was about to happen on Silas Beaumont's property west of town. The 5 miles between the Palestine courthouse and Silas Beaumont's property seemed to stretch far longer in Delilah May's mind. She sat beside Beaumont in the wagon, her hands folded in her lap, watching the familiar land pass. Cotton fields she had driven past countless times. The Hutchkins farm where she had once attended a quilting party. The crossroads where the Palestine Road met the old Indian Trail. Everything looked exactly as it always had, yet she was traveling through it as a totally different person than she had been that morning. Beaumont said nothing during the ride, his attention on the horses and the road. Delilah May liked the silence. The events of the past 4 days had left her drained of words, though not of thought. Her mind continued working through what had happened and what was about to happen, testing the limits of her new situation, like someone learning to walk after a long sickness. When Beaumont had first come to her in the Garrett sitting room 4 days earlier, Delilah May had been sitting by the window with sewing in her lap, the same spot she occupied most afternoons. She had heard his voice downstairs speaking with James. Then the house servant had called her to receive a visitor. Her immediate thought had been that some crisis needed her attention, possibly related to James' business matters. Instead, Beaumont had presented his plan with the same straight manner he might use to discuss horse breeding. He wanted to trade a stallion for her. James had challenged him to name terms for satisfaction, and these were his terms. The arrangement would be entirely legal and properly written down. Most importantly, and this was the point where Beaumont's voice had taken on a strength that made Delilah May focus completely on his words, the arrangement offered her something she had lost 3 years ago: control over her own life. "Your husband locks you to this house," Beaumont had said. "Treats you like a shame he can't solve. You have education, smarts, skills he doesn't value because he can only see your size. I am offering you the chance to use those skills in managing my household and business matters. You will work, Mrs. Garrett. You will be useful. That is more than your current situation provides." The talk had lasted 40 minutes, and by the end of it, Delilah May had asked only one real question: "What do you gain from this deal?" Beaumont's answer had been simple, and she felt truthful. "Satisfaction. Your husband insulted me publicly and hurt my business, taking away what he considers a burden while making him admit the trade publicly. That is worth more to me than money." Now, as they came near Beaumont's property, Delilah May saw it with fresh eyes. The house was smaller than she had expected, a story and a half, built from local wood with a covered porch and stone chimney. The barn, by contrast, was big and well kept, with fresh paint and strong fencing. Several horses ate grass in pens beyond the barn, and 3 men working near the corral stopped to watch the wagon arrive. Abraham, the older black man Beaumont employed, came out onto the porch as they arrived. He was perhaps 60, with gray hair and the careful dignity of someone who had learned to handle complex social situations. His eyes took in Delilah May's arrival with no visible surprise, though he must have heard rumors about what had happened at the courthouse. "Abraham, this is Mrs. Garrett," Beaumont said, helping Delilah May down from the wagon. "She will be managing the household from now on. Please show her through the house and help her get settled." "Yes, sir." Abraham replied, his tone plain. To Delilah May, he said, "This way, ma'am." The houses inside surprised her with its order. The main room combined kitchen and sitting area with a simple table, several chairs, and a metal stove that looked recently put in. 2 doors led to smaller rooms, one clearly Beaumont's bedroom, the other a storage area turned into a second sleeping space. Everything was clean but simple, the home of someone who spent little time indoors. "Mr. Beaumont is gone most weeks," Abraham explained, showing Delilah May around. "He keeps the house simple because he is not here to use much of it. I have been doing the cooking and cleaning, but it is more than one person can manage properly, especially with the horsework as well." Over the next several hours, as Abraham answered her questions and showed her how the property worked, Delilah May began to understand Beaumont's household. He hired Abraham and the 2 handlers, but the business was growing beyond what 3 men could effectively manage. Mail piled up unanswered. Money records existed in bits and pieces across many books. The house needed deep cleaning and better organization. Food preparation was okay, but boring. In short, Beaumont had been truthful. He needed household management, and Delilah May possessed exactly the skills needed. When Beaumont returned that evening after settling the horses and speaking with his handlers, he found Delilah May at the kitchen table with his books spread before her, making notes on a separate sheet of paper. "You work quickly," he noted, taking a seat across from her. "You have bills going back 14 months that haven't been balanced." She replied without looking up, "And your feed costs are much higher than they should be. Either your seller is charging too much or someone is taking a cut." Beaumont leaned back in his chair, a slight smile crossing his face. "I knew you would be useful. We need to discuss the terms of this deal more specifically," Delilah May said, finally meeting his eyes. "What you did at the courthouse was legal, but we both know it exists in gray territory. I need to understand exactly what you expect from me and what I can expect from you." They talked until well after midnight that first night, working out the practical details of their situation. Delilah May would manage all household matters, keep Beaumont's business records, handle mail, and oversee the home side of the property. In return, she would have control over those areas, a guaranteed amount of money for personal expenses, and the understanding that Beaumont's custody was for management rather than ownership. The arrangement was a job, not slavery, regardless of what the courthouse papers technically said. "And the social situation?" Delilah May asked. "People will talk. They will assume certain things. Let them talk," Beaumont said. "I will be gone most of the time anyway. What matters is that you will be doing useful work instead of sitting in a room waiting for your husband to be embarrassed by your existence." The blunt admission of her situation with James should have hurt, but instead Delilah May felt something close to relief. Beaumont dealt in plain facts, not social faking. There was freedom in that straightness. Over the following weeks, Delilah May changed Beaumont's household. She put in systems for keeping records that made his business money clear at a glance. She got better prices with sellers, catching the feed cost problem Beaumont had been too busy to notice. She reorganized the house, set up proper meal schedules, and began teaching Abraham better cooking methods, using recipes from her mother's collection. The physical work involved in managing a working property, combined with regular meals rather than the afternoon overeating that had marked her life at the Garrett house, began affecting her health. She lost weight slowly but clearly, and more importantly, she got back the energy and focus that had drained away during her years of forced inactivity. Abraham proved an excellent partner. He had been born enslaved in Kentucky and bought his freedom in 1845, then worked his way to Texas, doing various jobs before Beaumont hired him. His experience handling social ladders made him good at managing the subtle parts of their unusual household. He answered curious questions from visitors with polite, unclear answers, and helped Delilah May understand the local networks of trade and reputation that ruled business in Anderson County. Beaumont's two handlers, brothers named Curtis and Martin Yarrow, were at first unsure about Delilah May's presence, but quickly came to appreciate the improvements in daily work. They had been handling their own cooking and home needs alongside horsework, and having those duties lifted made their jobs much easier. Curtis, the older brother, possessed a gift for training difficult horses. Martin had an eye for bloodlines and shape that rivaled Beaumont's own skill. The property began working like a proper business, rather than a loosely organized operation run by a man who was rarely present. When Beaumont returned from his trading trips, he found detailed reports on expenses, mail answered, and decisions made in his absence that consistently proved sound. Palestine society, meanwhile, struggled to label what had occurred. The Garrett family name kept enough standing to prevent open scandal, but people whispered. James appeared at farm group meetings with the Morgan stallion, which became a topic of admiring talk. Everyone agreed the horse was amazing. Fewer people asked about Mrs. Garrett, and James offered no information. The general understanding, never stated clearly, was that the marriage had ended under circumstances best left alone. Delilah May's family in Crockett received a letter from her explaining that her situation had changed and that she was now managing a household and business affairs for Mr. Beaumont. The letter's tone suggested a job rather than scandal, and the Thornton family, already somewhat distant from their daughter since her marriage, accepted this explanation without pushing for details. By November 1858, the immediate shock of the courthouse trade had faded into background gossip, pushed aside by other concerns. Political tensions about land growth and slavery's future took up conversation. Palestine continued its cotton-driven wealth. Life moved forward, absorbing the unusual event the way communities always absorb things that don't fit comfortable boxes. But on Beaumont's property, something bigger than a business deal was developing. Delilah May discovered that she possessed skills beyond household management. She understood horses, not with Beaumont's natural sense for breeding and training, but with a thinking mind that could track bloodlines, spot market chances, and manage the business side of horse trading with care Beaumont had never achieved alone. When Beaumont returned from a buying trip to Louisiana in mid-December, Delilah May presented him with a plan. She had been writing to breeders in Kentucky and Tennessee, researching bloodlines and market prices. She had found a chance to buy 3 female horses with excellent Morgan heritage at prices below market value, due to an estate sale in Lexington. The cost would be large, but the potential profit through breeding and sales could change Beaumont's operation from skilled one-man trading to a real breeding business. Beaumont studied her research, asked pointed questions about her thinking, then approved the buy. "You are thinking bigger than I have been thinking," he said. "That is useful. I have spent 7 years watching my husband fail to think smartly about his plantation." Delilah May replied, "I learned what not to do." The transaction that had begun as Beaumont's revenge on James Garrett was turning into an actual partnership, one based on mutual benefit and helpful skills rather than the social and romantic bases that were supposed to rule relationships between men and women in Anderson County society. It was this unexpected growth that would make what came next so crushing. The Kentucky mares arrived in late January 1859, brought by train to Tyler and then overland to Palestine. They were everything Delilah May's research had promised. 3 females from established Morgan lines, aged 4 to 6 years, with confirmed breeding history and temper suited to both riding and harness work. The cost had required most of Beaumont's available money plus a loan from a Tyler bank arranged using the property as security. Curtis and Martin Yarrow looked at the mares with approval, and Beaumont himself spent 2 days checking shape and behavior before declaring the purchase sound. The first breeding would happen in spring, and if the bloodlines proved as strong as expected, the resulting foals could command top prices throughout Texas and beyond. Palestine's horse trading community took notice. Beaumont's operation had been respected but simple. A skilled trader who could find quality animals and train them effectively, the mare purchase signaled something different, ambition toward breeding stock and long-term business rather than simple trading. Several established breeders viewed this development with interest and some worry about competition. James Garrett heard about the mares through farm group conversations and understood immediately where the money for such a purchase had likely come from. The business skill he had dismissed in his former wife was now helping the man he had grown to hate. The Morgan stallion he had received in the trade ate grass in his pen, impressive to look at, but also a daily reminder of the deal that had gotten it. In February, James appeared at Beaumont's property unannounced, riding the Morgan stallion. Delilah May was working at the kitchen table with account books when she heard hooves coming and looked out to see her former husband getting down in the yard. She met him at the door before he could knock. "What do you want, James?" His eyes took in the changes visible even from the porch. Her smaller size, her direct look, the confidence in her stance that had been absent during their marriage. "I want to discuss the terms of our agreement," he said. "There is nothing to discuss. The agreement was done legally and is final." "I am prepared to offer new terms," James said. "I will pay Beaumont double the stallion's value to reverse the arrangement." Delilah May felt something cold settle in her chest. "I am not a horse that can be traded back and forth at your convenience. You signed papers giving Beaumont custody." James replied, "That makes you subject to negotiation." "No," Delilah May said simply. "The answer is no. Whatever arrangement you want to suggest, discuss it with Mr. Beaumont. I am telling you now that I won't agree to any reversal." James' face hardened. "You have forgotten your place remarkably quickly." "I have found my place," Delilah May corrected. "And it is not as your wife. Leave, James." He stood there for another moment, clearly wanting to say more, then turned and got back on the Morgan. As he rode away, Delilah May noticed Curtis Yarrow watching from the barn, having apparently seen the entire exchange. When Beaumont returned that evening from business in Tyler, Delilah May told him about James' visit. Beaumont listened without interrupting, then said, "He will be back. Men like Garrett can't stand losing, especially when the loss becomes public knowledge. The mares made it public. Everyone in the county knows where the money came from. What will you do if he makes a formal offer?" Delilah May asked. "I will refuse," Beaumont said. "The arrangement we have works. I am not interested in changing it." but James Garrett's appearance had been a spy mission rather than a negotiation. What he had seen at Beaumont's property, the improvements, the organization, the obvious success of the household and business, had confirmed his suspicions about where his former wife's skills were now directed. The knowledge burned. Throughout March and April 1859, James began making inquiries around Palestine about the legal status of the courthouse papers. He spoke with lawyers in Tyler and talked with Judge Patterson about the technical language used in the custody transfer. What he learned frustrated him. The papers were legally sound, if strange. Breaking the agreement would require proving either force or lack of mind, and James himself had publicly stated Delilah May's free consent at the courthouse. His focus shifted toward Beaumont's business operations. If he couldn't legally reclaim his former wife, he could potentially damage the business she was helping to build. James began spreading rumors about Beaumont's money situation, suggesting the mere purchase had put too much debt on the property. He questioned the breeding quality of the new stock in talks with other horse breeders. He made it known that he considered Beaumont's operation unsafe and advised against doing business with the horse trader. The attack was subtle but effective. Several potential buyers who had been considering horses from Beaumont's property decided to look elsewhere. A breeding contract that Curtis Yarrow had been working on for the Morgan stallion fell through after the other party expressed concerns about Beaumont's financial stability. Delilah May recognized the pattern from her years watching plantation society. This was reputation war, the kind of social fight that could destroy businesses without any direct fight. She brought her concerns to Beaumont in early May. "Garrett is poisoning your business relationships," she said. "We need to counter it directly." "How?" Beaumont asked. "I can't defend against whispers and hints." "No," Delilah May agreed. "But we can make the whispers meaningless by showing success. The mares will give birth starting next month. If the bloodlines prove strong, we will have proof that beats any rumor." The first foal arrived on June 3rd, 1859. A female with a clear Morgan build and a coat that matched her father's deep coloring. Curtis Yarrow, who handled most of the actual breeding work, called the foal perfect. The second mare produced a male 2 weeks later. Equally impressive, the third birth was expected in early July. Beaumont began receiving questions about the foals before they were even off milk. Word of quality bloodlines traveled quickly through horse breeding networks, and physical proof of successful breeding carried more weight than any rumor about money stability. James Garrett's campaign of reputation damage appeared to be failing. Then on July 8, 1859, Delilah May received a letter from her father in Crockett. The letter's tone was stiff and cold, quite different from the occasional friendly mail they had kept up since her move to Beaumont's property. Her father wrote that he had learned details about the courthouse trade from James Garrett, who had apparently visited Crockett to provide his version of events. The Thornton family was, the letter stated, deeply upset by the circumstances surrounding Delilah May's current situation. Her father demanded that she return to the family home immediately to discuss the matter. Delilah May read the letter twice, feeling the careful trap that had been built. James had gone to Crockett not to inform her family out of concern, but to use their reaction as a weapon. If she refused her father's order, she would appear to be under Beaumont's improper control. If she obeyed, she would be subjected to family pressure to leave Beaumont's household and return to respectable society, which given the circumstances would likely mean returning to James or accepting some other arrangement. Her family thought right. She showed the letter to Beaumont that evening. He read it silently, then handed it back. "Your decision," he said, "but understand that if you go to Crockett, your family will do everything possible to keep you there." "I know," Delilah May said, "which is why I am going to write my father and explain exactly what our arrangement entails. He deserves the truth, not James' version." The letter Delilah May wrote took her 3 days to write properly. She listed her situation during the final years of her marriage, the loneliness, the shame, the complete absence of purpose or control. She explained the courthouse trade not as a scandal, but as an escape from circumstances her father had never witnessed. She described her current work, the household she managed, the business skills she had developed. She made clear that Beaumont's custody was a work partnership, not ownership or bad relationship. Most importantly, she stated her right to choose this situation over returning to either James or to her father's house, to be managed like an embarrassing problem needing a solution. Her father's response, arriving 2 weeks later, was short. The family was disappointed in her choices and considered the matter closed. She would receive no further money support or social hello from the Thornton family. Her brother would handle any inheritance matters when the time came, but she should not expect family treatment. Delilah May read this letter alone in the kitchen and allowed herself 15 minutes of sadness before returning to the breeding record she had been updating. She had lost her family of birth, but she had gained something they couldn't understand. Work that mattered, skills that had value, partnership based on ability rather than social duty. The third mare gave birth in late July, producing twins, a very rare event in horses and one that carried big risk. Curtis Yarrow worked through the night to save both foals and their mother. By morning, all 3 had survived, though the twins were small and required careful care. Despite the risk and extra work, the twins represented a selling chance. Matched Morgan foals from quality bloodlines could command extraordinary prices from the right buyers. Delilah May immediately began writing to breeders and wealthy horse fans throughout the South, promoting the unusual birth. By August, Beaumont's operation had shifted from merely profitable to truly successful. The original money put in the Kentucky mares had paid for itself through breeding fees and early sales on the foals. The property's reputation within horse breeding circles had expanded beyond East Texas. Delilah May's business management had turned what had been skilled individual trading into a real commercial business. James Garrett watched this success with growing anger. The courthouse trade he had agreed to, thinking he was ridding himself of a burden, had instead empowered the very person he dismissed as worthless while at the same time helping his enemy. Every conversation in Palestine about Beaumont's breeding success was a silent reminder of James' mistake. In September 1859, James made one final attempt at direct talk. He appeared at Beaumont's property with a formal written offer. He would pay $3,000, several times the original stallion's value, to reverse the custody arrangement. The paper was properly drafted with spaces for Beaumont's and Delilah May's signatures. Beaumont received him in the yard, not inviting him into the house. Delilah May watched from the porch while Abraham stood nearby, his presence a quiet statement of household unity. "I am not interested in your offer," Beaumont said after reading the proposal. "That is a huge sum." James replied, "More than your entire property is worth." "Still," Beaumont said, handing back the paper, "the arrangement we have suits me perfectly. Mrs. Garrett has proven priceless to my operations. Why would I give that up? She is my wife, James said, his voice rising. The document said custody, not ownership, which means the arrangement can be changed. She was your wife, Beaumont corrected, and the custody arrangement stands as done. The matter is closed. James looked past Beaumont to where Delilah May stood on the porch. You actually prefer this, working like a servant for a horse trader. You could return to proper society. I prefer useful work to being locked up. Delilah May replied, The answer is no, James. It will always be no. James' face went through several emotions before settling on cold rage. You will both regret this, he said. I promise you that. He rode away on the Morgan stallion, his back stiff with fury. And this time, everyone present understood that something had shifted. The situation had moved beyond business fight or social awkwardness into territory where James Garrett's shame demanded satisfaction of a different kind. What none of them guessed was how carefully James had already been planning that satisfaction, or how far his planning had already gone. The first sign of real danger came not from James Garrett directly, but from an unexpected place. In late September, Abraham mentioned to Delilah May that he had met one of James' enslaved workers at the Palestine market. The man named Joseph had approached Abraham privately and delivered a mysterious warning. Tell Mrs. Garrett to be careful. Mr. James is planning something bad. When pressed for details, Joseph had shaken his head. I don't know exactly what, but he has been meeting with men from Tyler, rough men, not planters, and he has been asking questions about Mr. Beaumont's schedule, when he is home, when he is traveling. Delilah May brought this information to Beaumont that evening. His reaction was immediate and serious. Garrett is hiring violence, he said. That is what those meetings mean. For what purpose? Delilah May asked, though she already suspected the answer. To destroy what he can't reclaim. Beaumont replied, If he can't reverse the arrangement legally, he will eliminate it physically. Over the next 2 weeks, Beaumont made quiet preparations. He spoke with Curtis and Martin Yarrow about staying alert around the property. He bought 2 extra rifles and gave them to his workers. He changed his travel schedule to make patterns less easy to guess. Most importantly, he began sleeping in the barn rather than the house, thinking that any attack would likely target him directly. Nothing happened. The October weeks passed peacefully with autumn work going normally. The Morgan foals continued growing strong. Several sales contracts were finished, and Beaumont's breeding reputation continued growing. The warning from Joseph began to seem like too much caution, or perhaps even James' attempt at scaring them rather than a sign of actual violence. Then, on the night of October 23rd, 1859, everything changed. Beaumont had left for Arkansas 3 days earlier, planning to be gone for a week chasing a buying chance. His absence was known throughout Palestine. He had mentioned the trip at several businesses in town while making preparations. The property's defense therefore fell to Curtis and Martin Yarrow, Abraham, and Delilah May herself. The attack came at 2:00 in the morning. Delilah May woke to Abraham pounding on her bedroom door, shouting about fire. She came out to see orange light dancing through the windows. The barn was burning. She ran outside in her nightdress to chaos. The barn's entire west side was covered in flames, and she could hear horses screaming inside. Curtis and Martin were already working to open the barn doors and lead animals out, while Abraham had began hauling water from the well. though everyone knew the fire was already too large to fight effectively. Through the smoke and confusion, Delilah May caught looks of figures moving in the darkness beyond the fire's light. At least 3 men on horseback watching from a safe distance, not helping, not running, just watching. The next 30 minutes existed in pieces of memory that Delilah May would never fully put together clearly. Curtis managed to lead 6 horses to safety before the barn's roof began falling. 2 of the Kentucky mares and the Morgan stallion's first female baby were trapped inside when the structure fell, their screams cutting off suddenly as burning wood buried them. The other foals survived only because they had been in a pen rather than the barn, and Martin managed to lead them away before the fire spread. By the time the barn's roof completely fell in a shower of sparks, Delilah May stood in the yard with her face black from smoke, watching everything Beaumont had built burn. The 3 riders she had glimpsed earlier had vanished. Palestine's volunteer fire group arrived near dawn, too late to save the barn, but in time to prevent the fire from spreading to the house or other buildings. They worked until mid-morning containing the fire, then stood among the smoking ruins, discussing the cause. The fire marshal, a Palestine store owner named Hargrove, made his judgment quickly. Set on fire, he said, pointing to burn marks on the barn's west side. Someone used liquid fuel here and here. This wasn't an accident. Who would do such a thing? Curtis, Yarrow asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. That is for the sheriff to decide, Hargrove replied, but whoever did this knew their business, professional work. The sheriff arrived later that day, questioned everyone present, examined the remains, and took notes. He asked if anyone had enemies or knew of threats against the property. Delilah May mentioned James Garrett's previous visits and barely hidden threats, but carefully avoided giving the sheriff enough information to understand the full story of their fight. She knew that explaining the courthouse trade would hurt rather than support any case against James. "I will look into it," the sheriff said in the tone of someone who had already decided the search would lead nowhere. Setting fires was notoriously difficult to prove without witnesses, and the men Delilah May had seen in the darkness were long gone. Beaumont returned from Arkansas 2 days later to find his barn destroyed, 3 valuable horses dead, and his operations buildings badly damaged. He stood in the ruins for a long time without speaking, his face showing no emotion, while Curtis Yarrow listed what had happened. When Curtis finished, Beaumont turned to Delilah May. "You saw riders, 3 men on horseback, watching from beyond the fire's light." She confirmed. They left before the fire group arrived, and the sheriff. He took statements and left. "I don't think he will pursue it seriously." Beaumont nodded slowly as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "Garrett didn't do this personally. He hired it done, which means there is no proof connecting him to it. He is probably in Tyler or somewhere else with witnesses to prove he wasn't here." "What do we do?" Delilah May asked. "We rebuild," Beaumont said, "and we prepare for the next attempt." Because everyone understood, though no one said it clearly, that this wouldn't be James Garrett's final move. The barn burning had been revenge, but it had also been a show. Proof that James could strike at Beaumont's operation whenever he chose, and that the law wouldn't protect them. The money damage from the fire was huge. The barn itself represented significant money, but the lost horses were even more costly. 2 of the Kentucky mares had died, irreplaceable breeding stock. 1 of the Morgan foals was gone, along with months of investment in care and training. Insurance, to the extent it existed for such properties in 1008, 159 Texas, didn't cover arson when the criminals remained unknown. Beaumont spent the next week taking account of what survived and calculating the cost of rebuilding. The property could recover, but it would require using up their savings and likely taking on more debt. More troubling was the reputation damage. Word of the fire spread quickly through horse breeding circles, and potential buyers began expressing concerns about the stability of Beaumont's operation. James Garrett, meanwhile, made a point of appearing at the farm group's November meeting with expressions of sympathy for Beaumont's misfortune. He offered sadness on the lost horses, and even suggested that if Beaumont needed to sell any remaining stock to cover rebuilding costs, he would consider buying at fair prices. The performance was perfect. James positioned himself as a kind neighbor rather than a vengeful enemy, and several men present commented on his generous spirit. Only those who understood the full story of the situation recognized the display for what it was, a public statement of victory. Delilah May watched all this from a distance through reports from Abraham and the Yarrow brothers, who heard the gossip in Palestine. She spent her days working through Beaumont's money books, trying to find paths toward recovery that didn't require selling their remaining breeding stock at low prices. It was during this period of money crisis that Delilah May discovered something that changed her understanding of their entire situation. She had been reviewing Beaumont's mail files, looking for potential buyers or business contacts who might provide favorable terms for rebuilding loans. Deep in a stack of letters from 158 before the courthouse trade, she found an exchange between Beaumont and a horse breeder in Kentucky that mentioned James Garrett specifically. The Kentucky breeder had written asking about potential customers in East Texas for Morgan bloodstock. Beaumont's response, dated July 1008, 158, included this paragraph: James Garrett of Palestine has money but lacks judgment in horses. He recently purchased a male horse from me and later complained about a minor defect demanding a refund. I suspect he seeks to establish a reputation as a difficult customer to force future discounts. I don't recommend him as a buyer unless you want trouble. The letter was dated weeks before the famous fight at the farm group meeting, which meant the split hoof incident that had supposedly triggered Beaumont's desire for revenge had been known to Beaumont well in advance of their public fight. Delilah May sat with the letter for a long time, understanding forming slowly. The horse sale hadn't caused the fight. Beaumont had known the horse had a defect and sold it anyway, expecting James' complaint. The farm group fight hadn't been an unexpected insult. It had been a planned situation where James would publicly challenge Beaumont to name terms for satisfaction. Everything that followed, the courthouse trade, the custody arrangement, the building partnership between Beaumont and Delilah May, had been Beaumont's planned response to a situation he had created intentionally. She had known their arrangement was partly revenge, but she hadn't realized how carefully Beaumont had planned every step, including the original start. When Beaumont returned to the house that evening, Delilah May was waiting with the Kentucky letter on the table between them. "You planned the entire fight with James," she said without intro. "The broken horse, the public fight, all of it." Beaumont looked at the letter, then at Delilah May. "Yes. Why?" "Because I needed household management and business partnership," Beaumont replied. "And you needed escape from a situation that was destroying you. The courthouse trade accomplished both." "You played both of us," Delilah May said. You created a situation where James would feel forced to challenge you, knowing you could propose a deal he would be desperate enough to accept. I created a chance, Beaumont corrected. You chose to take it. So did Garrett. I didn't force either of you to sign those papers. Delilah May felt anger and something else. Respect for the calculation involved, mixed with knowing that Beaumont's trick had indeed given her skills and purpose she had lost during her marriage. "What happens now?" she asked. "James burns down your barn, maybe kills us next. Was that part of your planning?" "No," Beaumont admitted. "I underestimated how far Garrett's pride would drive him. That is my mistake." They sat in silence for several minutes, the candles burning down between them, both understanding that they had reached a critical point. The partnership they had built, regardless of how it had been started, was now threatened by growing violence neither of them had expected. "We need to end this," Delilah May said finally, "before someone dies." "Agreed," Beaumont replied. "The question is how?" What neither of them yet realized was that James Garrett had already decided how their situation would end, and his plan was far more complete than a burned barn. The answer to Beaumont's question arrived 2 weeks later, though not in any form either he or Delilah May anticipated. On November 18th, 1859, the Anderson County Sheriff appeared at Beaumont's property with a deputy and a formal warrant. The charge was fraud, specifically lying in the courthouse trade of September 1858. James Garrett had filed a complaint claiming that Beaumont had forced Delilah May into signing the custody papers, that the trade had been fundamentally fake, and that Beaumont had profited from illegal manipulation of his former wife. The warrant demanded that Beaumont appear at the courthouse for examination by Judge Patterson, with possible criminal charges to follow depending on the hearing's outcome. The timing was deliberately chosen. Beaumont was scheduled to leave for Louisiana in 2 days for a crucial breeding negotiation, and the hearing would force him to remain in Palestine. "This is absurd," Beaumont said, reading the warrant. "Mrs. Garrett signed those papers freely with the judge present. That is for the court to decide." The sheriff replied, "The hearing is set for day after tomorrow, 10 in the morning. Don't consider leaving town. That would make things much worse." After the sheriff left, Delilah May and Beaumont sat at the kitchen table with the warrant between them, understanding the smartness of James' strategy. He couldn't prove Beaumont had burned the barn, but he could use the very papers that had made their arrangement legal against them. By claiming fraud and force, James turned himself from an upset party into protector of his former wife's interests. "He will testify that you tricked me," Delilah May said, "that I couldn't have freely agreed because of my circumstances during our marriage, my loneliness, my size, my need for him. He will paint me as a victim rather than a participant, which hurts everything you have accomplished here." Beaumont noted, "If the court accepts that argument, it declares you unable to make decisions about your own life." "Exactly," Delilah May said. "Either I was forced, which makes you a criminal, or I was able, which makes James look foolish for the original trade. He is betting the court will find force more acceptable than admitting I chose this situation." The hearing 2 days later filled the courthouse with watchers drawn by gossip about the unusual case. James appeared with a lawyer from Tyler, a convincing speaker named Fulton, who specialized in property disputes. Beaumont and Delilah May arrived together without a lawyer. Beaumont couldn't afford a lawyer after the barn fire, and the speed of the hearing had left no time to arrange proper defense. Judge Patterson presided with visible discomfort, clearly wishing this matter had never entered his courtroom. He had signed the original papers, which made him partly involved in whatever had occurred. Fulton opened by painting a picture of Delilah May's situation during her marriage. Lonely, shamed, dependent entirely on her husband's care. He called James to testify about his former wife's increasing size and withdrawal from society, emphasizing how these factors had made her open to use. Mr. Beaumont, Fulton said during his speech, found Mrs. Garrett's weakness and used it for his own benefit. He tricked a weak woman into signing papers that effectively made her his property, all under the mask of a legal trade. This is fraud of the worst kind, taking advantage of someone's desperate circumstances for personal gain. When Beaumont's turn came to respond, he had no lawyer to filter his words. He stood before Judge Patterson and spoke directly. Mrs. Garrett signed those papers of her own free will in this courthouse with you as witness. She has since shown through her work managing my household and business that she is perfectly capable of making sound decisions. The fraud here isn't mine. It is Mr. Garrett's attempt to undo a legal trade because he has realized it benefited everyone except him. And what of the custody language? Judge Patterson asked. That was unusual phrasing. It was honest phrasing. Beaumont replied, I took responsibility for Mrs. Garrett's welfare in exchange for valuable payment. That is exactly what happened. Whether that makes people uncomfortable is separate from whether it was legal. The hearing continued through the afternoon with testimony from several witnesses about Delilah May's current situation. Abraham described the household's normal functioning. Curtis Yarrow discussed her business management. Even Martin, usually quiet, testified that Mrs. Garrett made decisions about the property's operations that were consistently sound. Finally, Judge Patterson called Delilah May herself to testify. She took the stand aware that everything she said would be checked for signs of either force or lack of ability. Mrs. Garrett, Judge Patterson said, Did Mr. Beaumont force you into signing the September papers? No, Delilah May replied clearly. He presented an option, and I chose to accept it. Were you aware of the meanings of those papers? Completely. I understood that I was ending my marriage and accepting Mr. Beaumont's custody, which meant in practical terms working for him in exchange for household management authority and personal freedom. And you considered this better to remaining married to Mr. Garrett? Delilah May looked directly at James before answering. I spent 3 years locked to a house treated as a shame my husband couldn't solve. Mr. Beaumont offered me useful work and respect for my skills. Yes, I considered and still consider that better. Fulton attempted to hurt her testimony with questions about her emotional state during the marriage, her loneliness, her need. But Delilah May answered each question with calm exactness, making clear that she had chosen her current situation not from desperation, but from knowing that it offered better opportunities than her marriage had provided. When the testimony ended, Judge Patterson paused the hearing to consider his decision. The courthouse emptied slowly with watchers discussing what they had heard in quiet groups. Beaumont and Delilah May returned to the property to wait. 2 days passed with no word from the court, then 3 days. The uncertainty stretched into a full week, while life on the property continued with the fake normalcy of people waiting for judgment. On the 8th day, a messenger arrived with Judge Patterson's written decision. Beaumont read it first, his face unreadable, then handed it to Delilah May. The ruling was careful and technical. Judge Patterson found no evidence of force in the September 1858 trade. The papers had been signed freely by able parties with full understanding of their meanings. However, and this was the critical point, the judge declared the custody language wrong and possibly invalid under Texas marriage law. His solution was to effectively end the custody arrangement while leaving the marriage ending intact. Delilah May was declared a free woman, neither married to James Garrett nor under Beaumont's custody. Any continued relationship between Beaumont and Delilah May would need to be set up as standard employment rather than the unusual custody framework. The decision satisfied no one. James had failed to prove fraud, but he had succeeded in hurting the legal framework of Beaumont's arrangement. Beaumont kept Delilah May's work, but lost the formal custody that had protected the situation from certain kinds of social criticism. Delilah May gained clear legal independence but lost the paper protection the custody arrangement had provided. Most significantly, the ruling left open questions about what would happen next. The barn was still burned. The breeding operation remained financially stressed, and James Garrett, having failed to achieve complete victory through legal means, now faced a choice about whether to push further. The answer came on November 30th, when Curtis Yarrow discovered 3 of their remaining mares dead in their pen, poisoned with something that had been mixed into their feed. The poisoning was precise. Only the breeding mares were affected, not the ordinary stock or the foals. This time there was no doubt about the target. Someone was systematically destroying Beaumont's breeding operation, horse by horse, attack by attack, and everyone involved knew who was responsible, even if proof remained hidden. Beaumont stood in the pen among the dead mares, his face finally showing the anger he had held back through months of growing conflict. "He won't stop," he said to Delilah May, "not until he has destroyed everything or we are dead. Then we need to finish this ourselves." Delilah May replied, "Because the law won't do it for us." What she proposed over the next several hours would have shocked anyone who had known her as James Garrett's lonely, shamed wife. But the woman who had emerged from that isolation had learned something crucial from her months managing Beaumont's business. Power came from understanding what people valued and being willing to threaten it. James Garrett valued his name above everything else, his standing in Anderson County society, his position in the farm group, his membership in the Masonic Lodge. These defined who he was more than his actual wealth or property. The